Anyways, first thoughts on. I just about said first thoughts on Gatsby, which implies the character and not the book. Your first thoughts on F. Scott Fitzgerald. Let's start with that. What do you think about his writing style? Robin?
It's a little confusing how sometimes we're in first person, sometimes we're in third person. Because I never got introduced to Nick, so I just read it through first person, and then they said Nick, I was like, who's Nick?
Right. That is an adjustment that one forgets about when one has read Gatsby a number of times, or at least is familiar enough with it that you know that the narrator is Nick. But at the beginning, you're reading a book called The Great Gatsby, and it's in first person, and you're thinking, was this Gatsby that's talking, right? And so that, I should say that happens to everyone the first time that they read the book. I'm not sure that I would say that it's intentional necessarily, but certainly Fitzgerald is obviously a capable enough writer that he could have made that clearer sooner if he had chosen to make it clearer sooner, if that kind of makes sense. So I'll say this about literature in general. It bears repeating from time to time also, and possibly you've heard this from me or from some other English teacher before, but in something that is written, or indeed something that you're viewing on a screen, that is a movie or film of some kind, television, all of the elements of it are intentional. They have to be, right? So if you're viewing me on a screen right now, we can say that most of the elements of this are intentional, at least if you're talking about my delivery of this particular lecture. But the elements of the awkwardness of this light and the sound qualities of the room, that's not something we're going to consider to be intentional or part of the intended product. But when you're reading a book, every word in there was written. And that should seem obvious, but we kind of tend to forget that sometimes. There are no accidental scenes. So what this means is that if something is described, the author meant to describe it. And this is important because many, many things, as you have to imagine, are not described. So if the author has chosen to describe something in more detail, that can't be accidental. Now, do we have to give the author a lot of credit? This is a legitimate question. Does the author know what they're doing, or did they describe this just because it's something they thought in their head? Did they include this scene just because they thought of it? Or does it serve some narrative or symbolic purpose? Now, we may be inclined to think, well, I don't know, if I was writing a book, I'm sure there'd be tons of crap in there that I didn't really think about all that much. But this isn't your book, and it's not my book. This is somebody who's had a work of literature published, and this, as we mentioned, is sort of universally acknowledged as a piece of classic literature. So we have to assume that Fitzgerald has included all of the elements that he has with intention, with purpose. So this is rather maybe overcomplicating the issue of a slight confusion on the first page about who exactly the narrator is. But what I am suggesting is that the only sensible way to try to interpret and criticize, not necessarily in a negative way, but in terms of literary criticism, a work of literature is to assume that all of its elements are deliberate. And in fact, we don't, as we'll discover later on, we don't have to care what the author intended at all. That those items are in there is enough for us to consider them as deliberate. So our momentary confusion over who Gatsby is, we have to consider as being an intentional part of the narrative. The accessibility of Fitzgerald's language, did you find, as I think most people do, did you find that it took a bit of an adjustment to get used to the way that he speaks or writes? Now, part of this is just the passage of time. So he's writing from a different historical period, and their parlance, their day-to-day vocabulary is different from ours because it has to be. It's almost 100 years ago. And so that makes sense, but it's a long way from Shakespeare in that we have to really consider looking up translations. There are no present-day English translations of The Great Gatsby because the language hasn't changed that much. So probably if you are a reasonably experienced reader and literate person, there's a bit of an adjustment period to the way that he writes, but then you find that you just have adjusted to it, and it doesn't cost as much of your mental energy to sort of deal with that. Does that sound accurate? Okay. I just wanted to check. If you continue to struggle with the language, certainly there are many things in there that probably I will need to clarify for you in terms of specific events or specific references that you might reasonably not be expected to know how the 1920s worked exactly. So it may be surprising to you that I also don't have firsthand experience of how the 1920s worked. But maybe I've just seen enough movies or read enough books that I'm more familiar with it. Certainly I've done some research on the topic as well. So there's always lots that we can learn from listening to other smart people talk about things and explain things to us. So what I want us to spend time on first is some of the main characters. So what I've done here is I've created a series of slides, one for each one of the central characters, and I've put one quotation from the first 3 chapters that is about or by that character, which reveals some aspect of their personality. So we're going to look at each one of those, and then as a group, we'll try to flesh that out. So what you may want to do then is to take some notes on this, or you may want to revisit this video later on, assuming that I'm able to, negotiate the technology and wrestle it up into a YouTube form of some kind, which is in no way guaranteed. I hope to be reasonably successful. Following that, I have a separate section on ideas and symbols, and again, one slide on each of those. We're not going to get through all of them today, but we'll spend some time talking about what I think are the most important ones for the first 3 chapters, or perhaps what you think are the most important ones for the first 3 chapters. The fact that I have divided characters from symbols and ideas is in fact a bit arbitrary. And what I mean by this is that there are many ways. This book is famously heavy with symbolism. An incredible heap of symbolism on every single page. Symbols can always be debated in terms of what they mean, but the frequency with which Fitzgerald mentions that things are yellow cannot be accidental. The symbols are symbols not because necessarily Fitzgerald intended them to be so, but because subsequent generations of readers have found them to be so. And I, being influenced by those other generations, also find these symbols to be apparent. And so we will sort of skip over the question of how relative that should be, whether you are free to dismiss any of these symbols in your own reading as being irrelevant or unintentional or whatever, but in part of understanding the sort of historical criticism, the historical understanding of this novel, we'll look at the sort of generally accepted symbols, which was a bit of a sidebar to the central point which I wanted to make, which was that the characters themselves are in many ways symbols in this book. Gatsby is, and he almost seems like a symbol right from the first page, right from when he's introduced, because he's so just set apart from everyone else. And I don't think it's hard to see Tom Buchanan as a symbol or Daisy Buchanan as a symbol. Like they represent things. They're not just individuals. They're fictional literary characters, and they all kind of represent some aspects of ideas or culture that Fitzgerald wanted to bring to mind, I guess, to speak broadly. Some of these things he wanted to probably, again, speaking of author's intent is tricky, but some of these characters, some of the things that they stand for, he seems to have wanted to mock or to disparage in some way, but not all of them, and so that's why I've chosen the phrasing, to bring to mind rather than to cause a reaction to. So let's start with our narrator.